Why do we only ever hear that 93% of homicide suspects are men, but not that 93% of firefighters are men? That's the question posed by the Tin Men. And the obvious answer is that when men aren't committing heinous acts of violence, they aren't a problem that needs to be talked about and addressed. The Tin Men, however, wants us to actively lavish praise on men for not being part of the problem, to celebrate heroic masculinity, adding that yes, most terrorists are male, but so are those putting their lives on the line to stop such people. It's true, it is usually men who set the fire, but it's also true that it's usually men who kick down the door and haul you to safety. And again, there's an obvious answer here, that if men didn't set the fire, weren't so quick to jump to violence, then there wouldn't need to be such a large core of men who have to risk injury and their lives stepping in to clean up the mess. It's a reiteration of the point that patriarchy isn't about protection, it's a protection racket, one that asks men to give up their lives rather than address men's violence, and then label it as heroism rather than a completely avoidable tragedy. But let's actually do as George asks and talk about that statistic, that 93% of firefighters are men. The first question, the one that almost never seems to be asked, is why? Why is it that certain jobs like firefighter are still heavily dominated by men? A 2019 study looked at how professional prototypes and social stereotypes commonly assigned to men and women undervalue specific demographics in those professions. For example, if the set of traits perceived to be essential for success, the prototype for, say, a firefighter, is someone who carries people out of burning buildings, then that's going to fit more closely with masculine stereotypes. That, in turn, makes it harder to imagine a woman in that role, deterring women from even applying. Not only that, but women in that role will face then greater skepticism, be undervalued, underpaid, all creating further underrepresentation. The paper talks about how physical strength is used as a litmus test for firefighters. Most departments use the Candidate Physical Abilities Test to evaluate recruits. This is a grueling, timed physical test that requires performing a number of tasks while wearing a 50-pound vest to simulate the weight of breathing apparatus and protective clothing. Around 30% of applicants who take the test will fail. However, for women, that failure rate jumps to a staggering 85%, meaning very few women are capable of passing the stringent physical requirements to be a firefighter. But those that do are still viewed with suspicion, seen only to have qualified by lowering the physical standards in order to increase representation, leading to women being viewed as threats to the crews they join, not colleagues and assets. With the study saying that almost all of the female firefighters they talked to reported being treated as if they did not belong in the profession. Women firefighters routinely faced skepticism and criticism, and reported constantly needing to prove themselves as exceptional under an intense spotlight, all of which creates an environment that discourages and is actively hostile towards women. Which, sure, is deeply regrettable, but if those are the physical demands the job requires, then we can't change that without putting people's lives in danger, right? Well, see, it turns out that the professional prototype of firefighters is deeply flawed. The paper itself calls out many firefighters admit it. Although physical strength is the most common metric used to evaluate a prospective firefighter's capability for the job, it is not consistently the most critical characteristic needed to do the job well. The vast majority of calls are for medical aid and do not require exceptional strength. And this is backed up by data from the National Fire Protection Association. The overwhelming majority of calls, over 2/3, are to render medical aid. Meanwhile, less than 4% of calls are in response to fires, and that number has been steadily decreasing for the last 2 decades. Fire departments are rejecting almost 90% of women who apply because they are unfit to perform a task they may never be called to do. And legal challenges to these openly discriminatory hiring practices have been going on for at least the last 40 years. They detail how women face deliberate sabotage in their evaluations, from ill-fitting equipment to changing requirements, and those battles are still going on today. But the other issue is we know from countless studies that cultures that actively discriminate become a breeding ground for harassment and hatred against women and minorities, and fire departments are no exception. The LA Fire Department has been plagued with issues for decades, such as Brenda Lee, a black firefighter who had her mouthwash mixed with urine. The LA Times wrote that white men aren't immune either. Those who have come to the defense of women, minorities, and same-sex oriented individuals are also harassed. Chicago's fire department has also been slammed with harassment lawsuits for years, with almost 2/3 of female paramedics reporting that they have experienced harassment, as well as a gay firefighter who was harassed by a female supervisor, which he believed was because he didn't fit her vision of a heterosexual masculine firefighter and needed to be straightened out. Cincinnati. Long Island, West Memphis, Cobb County, and Boulder County fire departments have all made headlines just in the last year, as well as an absolutely horrifying case involving firefighters from Albuquerque. Overall, over half of female firefighters report either being assaulted, harassed, or know someone who was during their fire EMS roles. Back in 2017 for the Arizona Daily Star, Tim Stella wrote about 3 news events, all from the same week, involving local firefighters. The funeral of firefighter Jose Semeniego, who was given a wall of honor in tribute to his service. Another involving a former Tucson fire captain being sentenced for a triple homicide. And another involving an active Tucson fire captain who showed up to a restaurant, shot and injured his ex-wife, unalived the man she was with before turning the weapon on himself. In the aftermath, there was a desire to explain the latter 2 events as a result of the macho culture of the fire services that encourages firefighters to be tough and bottle it up. The tragic accumulation of trauma and stress released as violence that is often seen across first responder professions. Stella writes that perhaps this is part of the explanation, but it can't be all of it, since we see these violent acts so often in men who are not firefighters as well. And this is the limitation of George's black and white narrative, because the reality is these 2 statistics, that men make up the majority of perpetrators of violent crime and the majority of men are firefighters, are inexorably linked. They have the same root cause. We can't talk about how 93% of firefighters are men without talking about men's violence. This idea that George has that violent men are a different type, one to be put on a shelf and dealt with for sure, but easily identifiable villains that can be entirely sorted and separated away from the heroes, the quote-unquote good men, has been demonstrated to be false time and time and time and time again. Plenty of men who are seen as pillars of their community turn right around and commit outrageous acts of violence in their own homes. And studies consistently show that our biggest predictor for finding these villains is a homogenous culture that overemphasizes and overvalues harmful masculine norms. Exactly the kind of flawed and incorrect professional prototypes and social stereotypes we have constructed around first responders, which is what makes the Tin Men's approach to this topic so harmful for men. The refusal to accept or even acknowledge the link between these 2 statistics, as well as the need to constantly dismiss and distract from talking about the prevalence of violence among men, not only prevents any meaningful dialogue from taking place, but it also continues to put men in harm's way by failing to address and, more importantly, provide solutions for what data consistently shows is the root cause of men being harmful, not just to those around them, but also to their own mental and physical health.